Hello everyone. Okay, so today is a 3-book video. For you I have Sara Baume's A Line Made by Walking, James Miller, Un-American Activities, and Geoffrey Jenkins, A Grue of Ice. These are 3 books I read for very different reasons, utterly different books. The first one I read as part of my Goldsmith's Prize shortlist reading, but also as part of my general attempt to keep abreast of fairly cutting-edge literary fiction. The other 2 I read purely for fun, and they absolutely fulfilled that requirement. But first, the Sara Baume. So this book was shortlisted for this year's Goldsmith's Prize, which is where I first came across Sara Baume. But it's her second novel, so her first novel was extremely successful. And this is absolutely at the innovative literary fiction end, as you would expect from something that's shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize. Neil Griffiths has talked about it on his channel, and I'll leave a link to that below. But here's my take on it. So this is a novel about what it is like to create art and the type of life you have to live in order to create art. It's also a novel about sort of low-level depression in your 20s when you don't know what to do with your life and when it suddenly feels as though you're maybe not quite as brilliant as you originally hoped that you might be, and you're maybe not going to take the world by storm after all. So it's a novel about a girl in her 20s living in Dublin, and it starts with her lying on the floor of her unpleasant house share, crying and crying and crying, and eventually calling her parents and saying, I need something has to change, I'm miserable, I can't stop crying. And she moves out of that bedsit, goes back briefly to her parents' house, and then moves into the house which her grandmother lived in until she died a couple of years previously. So she's living in this dead woman's house with none of the things around her having changed since her grandma died. And it's sort of an exploration of that low-level depression, lack of interest in anything in life, being unable to find the motivation to do anything, get on with anything. And it's very much a book about the sort of the minutiae of what it is like to be living your life like that. That's half of it. In parallel, she was an art student and still wants to have the motivation to make art, but is unable to find the will to do so. And eventually she begins to find that again by taking photographs of dead animals that she finds, so animals that have been run over or half killed by foxes or whatever. So dead animals she finds out in the world. And the photos that she takes of that begin to become some sort of series of works of art in their own right. And running in parallel to those 2 strands, which are sort of the aspects of her life which are unfolding, she also is remembering her time as an art student and forcing herself constantly to recollect specific works of art, specific works of modern art, to fit whatever emotion she is feeling at that time or whatever she's just noticed at that time. So you'll get a long passage about her moving, gently weeping through different rooms in her grandmother's house, looking at the dead flies and the dead wasps on the windowsills, followed by a description of a work of art which is about dead animals or about windowsills or about the blue sky that she sees out of the window as she is wandering between the rooms. So it's a rather, and the irony of course of it is that this book about not being able to produce art is in fact a work of art in itself, and also a book in which the protagonist manages to produce something which is in some sense a work of art. It's a clever book, it's an intricate book, it is a very knowledgeable book in its contemporary art knowledge, which is not a subject I know anything about at all. I didn't really like it, and I thought it was really good, and I couldn't quite work out what it was that prevented me from loving this book, because in a sense the topic is one that I'm interested in. I've written about depression. This is a different sort of variety of depression, but it's a linked topic. It's mostly utterly beautifully written and fabulous prose, and it's cutting edge literary fiction. I'm interested in that sort of thing, and I think where I ended up was that this book is relentlessly negative in a sort of low-level way. So it very much acts out the state of mind that the protagonist is in, which of course is entirely appropriate, but it's a state of mind that I didn't want to be spending hours of my life living in. Everything that happens to her, she sees the negative side, and not in a sort of self-defeating, I'm determined I am going to see the negative side of this sort of way. It's simply that every thought that drifts into her mind is a negative one, whatever it is triggered by. And I found that relentlessly difficult to live with. And at the same time, of course, that's the sign of it being a very successful book, because that is absolutely the state of mind that it's aiming to describe. So I found this Line Made by Walking by Sara Baume. It's good. It's really good. It would be my probably joint first choice for this year's Goldsmiths prize between this and Reservoir 13, which I've raved about elsewhere. But I have to say, I didn't particularly enjoy the experience of it. I will, however, read whatever Sara Baume writes next, because I think she's my sort of writer. And yes, the subject matter was painful to read, but it's a good book. I recommend it, sort of. So that was book one. Book two was read for enjoyment purposes only. And this is not a book whose topic I would normally go for at all. So it is about zombies and vampires and other types of slightly science fiction-y Americana. It's a book of linked short stories, and they're primarily satirical. I don't normally go for satire, I don't normally go for Americana, and I've never read anything about zombies or vampires before. There's also a sort of UFOs section in this as well. And the reason I bought this book was I went to a book reading where James Miller read out a section of one of these stories, and it was hilarious. So I bought this for amusement value, and it's really, really funny. It's beautifully written. He picks up the voices of his slightly mad American characters very, very accurately, to my British ear anyway. And it's just theme after theme of cliched American life comes through. So the zombies, the vampires, the UFOs, the guns, the evangelical Christianity, the conspiracy theories. And it's dealt with in a light-hearted, amusing way. There are a couple of the stories which I found less successful. I found the final story, which sort of brings a lot of this together, slightly less successful than the others. It felt to me a little bit like an exercise in trying to bring the rest of it together, rather than having the spark of the story in its own right. But many of the stories in here I found hilarious and fascinating, and just really nice, relatively light reading. So Un-American Activities by James Miller, I recommend for pure enjoyment. And then the other book that I read in the last week or so, A Grue of Ice by Geoffrey Jenkins, also I read for unalloyed enjoyment. Completely different type of book. So I have a small category of books on my shelves, which is basically sort of Second World War and shortly after adventure yarns of various sorts. And it's a collection that includes a book called No Picnic on Mount Kenya, which is about Italian prisoners of war in Africa escaping the British prisoner of war camp they were in order to go and climb Mount Kenya and then coming back. So it's a sort of adventure story about climbing a mountain in the middle of wartime. No Picnic on Mount Kenya, highly recommended. I've got one called Skis Against the Atom, which is about a group of cross-country skiers in occupied Norway during the Second World War, managing to do a clandestine mission to bomb the factory in which the Germans were trying to produce heavy water in order to produce an atom bomb. Also highly recommended. There's one called the Shetland Bus, which I love, which is about Norwegian fishermen, again, trying to operate in occupied Norway during the Second World War. And this very much fits into this category. So it's not actually a Second World War book. It's set about 10 years later, but it has a lot of that feel. So a lot of the characters in it have been submarine captains, or they have been in charge of parts of the British Navy in bits, in sort of various not terribly well-known bits of the world. And it's there's a what's the word I want? Blurb on the back from Ian Fleming. It is a sort of James Bond-like book, but with this sort of post-war theme. And it is, I picked it up in a second-hand bookshop just because it looked as though it might fit into this little slightly obscure category of mine. And it's an absolutely hilariously impractical, unrealistic story of nasty submarine captains and people with one hand operating helicopters in the Antarctic in terrible weather. It's an entirely unrealistic, absurd adventure yarn, and in that sense was a joy to read in a completely different way. I got absolutely, I felt throughout that it was utterly unrealistic. Nonetheless, I got absolutely caught up in it. It's the sort of book that where I was reading, I couldn't stop in order to eat or drink anything until I'd got to the end and worked out how it was going to be ended. So if you ever happen to come across a guy called Geoffrey Jenkins who wrote A Grue of Ice, he apparently also wrote a book called A Twist of Sand, then if you want a ridiculous 1950s ripping adventure yarn with improbable characters, then Geoffrey Jenkins is your man. So that's been this week's reading. I am now reading a little bit of non-fiction at the moment. I'm about to start on a biography of Tolstoy. I decided that Tolstoy was a writer I should know more about. So that's on my list at the moment. And I've also been reading a book published by the UK independent publisher And Other Stories, Sorry to Disrupt the Peace, which was on the Republic of Consciousness Prize long list this year. So I suspect my next book review video may well be on one or both of those. And in the meantime, I'll try and do another one about writing as well. Various of you said that you really enjoyed the last video on writing, so I will do another one of those. In the meantime, happy reading, and we will be in touch soon.